When I opened my eyes, the cold grass was under my bare feet and the night air chilled my skin. I blinked, disoriented, trying to piece together where I was. Then I looked up and saw my house, dark, silent, and still. I wasn't supposed to be outside, but somehow I was. I opened my eyes to the cold bite of wet grass beneath my bare feet. My body shivered as the night air pressed against me, sharp and unrelenting. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The stillness of the backyard, bathed in pale moonlight, felt surreal, too vivid to be real. Then I saw my house. It stood a few feet away, silent and dark. The windows, usually warm and glowing at night, were lifeless, blackened like hollow eyes watching me. I rubbed my arms, trying to remember how I'd gotten there, but my mind was blank. My heart raced as panic set in. I turned, scanning the yard. Everything looked normal, except for me. My pajama bottoms were damp from the dew, and my shirt clung to my skin. I was outside, barefoot and trembling, but I didn't remember leaving my bed. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Bare, muddy prints trailed across the yard, leading away from where I stood. I froze, staring at them, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't mine. The shape was wrong. Too wide, too long, like they belonged to something inhuman. Behind me, a soft whisper rose from the shadows. Low and indistinct, it sent chills down my spine. I whipped around, but the yard was empty. For now. The footprints stretched across the yard, leading toward the dark tree line at the edge of the property. My breath caught as I crouched to inspect them. The mud was fresh, still glistening, the edges sharp against the wet grass. Whatever made them had been here recently. Very recently. The shape of the prints was wrong. They were too long, too narrow, with an unnatural curve at the toes. Something about them made my skin crawl. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to go inside and lock the doors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me forward, an invisible thread tugging at my chest. I took a shaky step toward the trees, then another. The night grew quieter with each step, as though the crickets and rustling leaves were holding their breath. As I reached the edge of the woods, I heard it again, the whisper. It was faint and garbled, like a voice carried on the wind, just out of reach. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped. A shadow moved between the trees, quick and fleeting, gone before I could focus on it. My heart pounded as I stepped into the woods, following the trail. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. The footprints continued, deeper into the trees, but something about them had changed. They weren't just leading away anymore. They were circling back. To me, the trees swallowed me whole. The air inside the woods was thick, damp, and oppressive. The faint light of the moon struggled to break through the twisted branches above, casting jagged shadows across the forest floor. The footprints were still there, but they were different now, deeper, heavier, and spaced farther apart, as if whoever or whatever was making them had started running. I didn't want to follow them. Every step felt like a mistake, but something compelled me to keep going. My breaths came in shallow gasps, each exhale visible in the unnaturally cold air. The whispering returned, louder this time. It echoed from every direction, layered with an unnatural cadence that made my head throb. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and thin. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then I saw it. A flash of movement in the distance, just beyond the trail. A shadow darted between the trees, quick and unnatural, too large to be human. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands trembled as I took a step back, and a twig snapped beneath my foot. The whispering began again, closer now, and the shadows moved. Not just one, but many, weaving through the trees like predators circling their prey. Then I realized The footprints weren't leading me deeper into the woods. They were guiding something toward me. I turned to run, but the path I had come from was gone, swallowed by the forest. The shadows seemed to chase me, their presence thick and suffocating, but then I saw it, the faint glow of light cutting through the trees. Desperate, I pushed forward, branches clawing at my arms and face until I stumbled into a clearing. The air here was different, heavier. The ground was scorched black, cracks spreading through the earth like veins. In the center stood a massive tree, ancient and gnarled, its twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. But it wasn't the tree that held my attention. It was what lay beneath it. A circle of stones surrounded the base, each etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. Inside the circle, a figure knelt, motionless. Its back was to me, but its outline was wrong. Too thin, too long. Its head tilted slightly as if sensing my presence. The whispers returned, louder and clearer, weaving through the air like a chant. The figure began to move, its arms twitching unnaturally. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It turned slowly, revealing a face that wasn't human, its skin pale and stretched too tightly over its skull, its eyes deep, endless voids. "You came," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. The stones around the circle flared, casting the clearing in an unnatural light. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized the whispers weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from the tree, and it was alive. The ground shook violently, knocking me to my knees. The glowing stones around the tree pulsed faster, their light blinding against the suffocating darkness of the woods. The whispers grew louder, chaotic and piercing, filling my head until I thought my skull would crack. The figure under the tree rose to its full height, impossibly tall and impossibly thin. Its hollow eyes locked onto me, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing jagged teeth. It pointed a long, bony finger at me, and a searing heat shot through my chest. I screamed, clutching at my shirt as the pain intensified. When I tore the fabric away, my breath hitched. A mark was burning into my skin, a circular symbol with jagged lines, identical to the ones etched into the stones. The heat was unbearable, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. "You are chosen," the figure rasped, its voice layered with countless others. The tree groaned, its twisted branches stretching toward me as the earth beneath it cracked open. From the fissure, a deep red light poured out, pulsing in time with the mark on my chest. The whispers became words, incomprehensible but commanding, burrowing into my mind. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, but my body felt heavy, rooted to the ground. The mark on my chest burned hotter, as if tethering me to this place. The figure tilted its head, a low, guttural laugh escaping its throat. "You belong to it now," it hissed. Behind me, the forest began to close in. Shadows stretched toward me, merging with the tree's ominous glow. I turned and ran, but I could feel it, the mark pulsing, binding me to something I couldn't escape. The whispers followed louder than ever. I burst from the woods, gasping for air, the mark on my chest pulsing with an unbearable heat. My house came into view, a dim silhouette against the night sky. Relief flooded me. Just a few steps, and I'd be safe. I stumbled up the porch steps, flung open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. For a moment, the silence felt reassuring, but as I leaned against the door, catching my breath, I realized something was wrong. The house didn't feel like home anymore. The air inside was heavy and cold, laced with a faint metallic smell. The shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor, pooling in the corners like living things. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock were gone. I stepped forward, my bare feet sticking to something wet. My heart raced as I looked down. A trail of muddy footprints led from the back door to the center of the living room. They weren't mine. The whispers followed me inside, faint and persistent, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. I moved cautiously toward the living room, where the footprints stopped. A dark stain marred the rug, and above it, the shadows on the wall shifted, twisting into a familiar shape. The figure from the woods. The mark on my chest burned hotter, and I stumbled back as the shadow began to move. "Welcome home," the voice rasped, echoing from every corner of the house. I turned to run, but the door wouldn't budge. I wasn't alone. The house pressed in around me, cold and alive. Every shadow stretched too far, flickering like it was hiding something waiting to pounce. The mark on my chest pulsed in time with the whispers that now filled every corner of the room. I tried to move toward the stairs, thinking I could barricade myself in my bedroom. But the walls seemed to breathe, the plaster groaning with unseen tension. As I stepped forward, my foot sank into the rug. It wasn't the plush softness of fabric. It was wet. I glanced down to see dark, muddy water pooling at my feet, spreading outward. The same water I'd seen in the woods. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls, and then everything plunged into darkness. My breath quickened as the whispers grew louder, circling me, their words garbled but filled with anger and hunger. I grabbed for my phone, fumbling with trembling hands to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the black, illuminating the room, and then it stopped, frozen on the figure standing at the base of the stairs. It was the same creature from the woods, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. Its bony hand raised, pointing at me. "You can't run," it rasped, its voice a sickening mix of a growl and a scream. The mark on my chest burned hotter than ever, and the whispers steadily grew into a roar. My vision blurred as the darkness consumed the room. Then I heard the door creak open behind me. Something else was coming in. When I opened my eyes, the house was still. The whispers had stopped, and the air was heavy with silence. I was lying on the living room floor, drenched in sweat, the mark on my chest still burning faintly. For a moment I thought it was over, until I noticed the footprints. Muddy and wet, they led from the front door, circling me and disappearing into the walls. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving, and stumbled toward the door. But when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. No, sealed. The house felt alive, its walls breathing, the shadows deepening around me. The faintest whisper began again, so soft it could have been in my own head. The mark on my chest pulsed, and I realized I wasn't alone. I'll never leave this house, and neither will they. Have you ever woken up somewhere you don't remember going? Be careful, it might not be a dream. Are you sure you're alone? Or is something waiting for you just out of sight? At first I thought it was a coincidence. A man standing just beyond the cemetery gates, motionless, always staring as I drove past. His eyes never left mine, even as the car sped by. But now I'm sure of one thing. He's waiting for me. The first time I saw him, it was barely dawn, the sky painted with streaks of gray and orange. I was rushing to work, bleary-eyed and distracted, when I caught sight of the cemetery. Something about it felt different that morning. That's when I noticed him. He was standing just inside the rusted iron gates, his face pale and ghostly in the soft light. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, and his hands hung stiffly at his sides. What froze me wasn't his presence but his gaze, locked onto me as my car passed. At first I thought he was just a mourner, lost in grief, but his eyes followed my car with unnatural precision. The unease crept in slowly, like a chill slipping under my skin. When I glanced back in the rearview mirror, he was still there. He hadn't turned or walked away. He just stood there, watching. By the time I reached the office, I had almost convinced myself I was imagining things. People visit cemeteries, right? It's normal. But the memory of his stare lingered. It wasn't curiosity or sadness in his expression. It was something deeper, darker, like he knew me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in my own home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there waiting. And I couldn't help but wonder, Would he still be there tomorrow? The next morning, I drove past the cemetery again. A nervous laugh bubbled up in my chest. There was no way he'd still be there. It had to have been a weird coincidence, or maybe even a trick of my tired brain. But as my car crept closer to the gates, the laughter died in my throat. He was there. Same spot, same dark coat, same pale face. And his eyes, those unblinking, piercing eyes, followed me with mechanical precision as I passed. A shiver crawled up my spine, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I sped up, desperate to escape his gaze, but it stayed with me, burning into the back of my mind. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, staring at the empty road where my car had been. It wasn't possible. How could someone stand so still, so lifeless, yet feel so present? By the time I got home that evening, my nerves were shot, but I couldn't stop myself. I drove back to the cemetery, convinced he'd be gone in the fading twilight. But he wasn't. This time he was closer. Not by much, just a few steps closer to the gate. My heart pounded as I slowed the car. He didn't move. He didn't blink. I slammed the gas pedal and drove away, but a sickening thought clawed its way into my mind. What if he's waiting for me to stop? The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the man was just part of my imagination, some trick of stress and exhaustion. But as I approached the cemetery again, dread knotted in my stomach. I slowed as the gates came into view. He was there. This time, he wasn't just watching. His head tilted slightly, unnaturally, as if acknowledging me. My blood turned to ice. I pressed the accelerator, forcing myself to speed past without looking back. That night, things got worse. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something strange in the bathroom mirror. A faint smudge had appeared just over my shoulder. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Shaking my head, I wiped the mirror clean and went to bed, telling myself I was imagining things. But the dreams came. I was standing at the cemetery gates, the man standing closer than ever. His face was pale, his hollow eyes boring into mine. As I tried to back away, I realized my feet were stuck, rooted to the ground. The whispers began, faint and cold, circling me. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. My heart pounded as I looked around my dark room. Then I froze. The faint outline of a handprint lingered on the outside of my window, smudged against the glass. I hadn't opened that window in weeks. The handprint on the window haunted me all night. By morning, my exhaustion was outweighed by a need to understand. I had to know who, or what, was watching me. I started at the library. The cemetery on Briar Road was old, dating back to the 1800s. Most of the records were fragments, articles about renovations or mentions in historical documents. But buried in the archives, I found something unsettling. A cluster of reports about a man named Elias Greaves. Greaves had been the cemetery caretaker for decades, known for his strange habits. He lived on the property and rarely left. Townspeople whispered about him, calling him a recluse and even a witch. But in 1923, Elias disappeared. Witnesses claimed to have seen him standing at the gates the night before, staring at the road as if waiting for something, or someone. The more I read, the worse it got. After his disappearance, drivers reported seeing a pale figure near the cemetery. Some claimed he followed them home. Others said he marked them, leaving symbols on their doors or windows. My chest tightened. The handprint on my window, it wasn't just a coincidence. I slammed the book shut, panic rising like bile. My skin prickled, the air in the library suddenly cold. I turned my head slowly and saw a shadow move across the wall, far too tall and thin to belong to anyone nearby. I ran, and as I reached my car, I froze. On the windshield, faint and smeared, was the same handprint. The drive home was silent except for the pounding of my heart. The handprint on the windshield stayed in my mind, a mocking reminder that I couldn't outrun this. As I approached the cemetery, my hands tightened on the wheel. The gates came into view, and there he was. This time, he wasn't behind the fence. He was standing in the road. My headlights illuminated him clearly, his pale skin, his empty eyes, the faint smirk pulling at his lips. I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a stop. He didn't move. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen, the car idling in the quiet. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed to the cemetery gates. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. He tilted his head, his gaze unblinking, and took a single step forward. My breath caught. I hit the gas, swerving around him, but the moment I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. He was no longer in the road. He was in the back seat. I screamed, the car swerving violently. When I looked again, the seat was empty. My chest heaved and my pulse thundered as I sped home, my knuckles white on the wheel. But when I parked in the driveway, I saw him again, standing under the streetlight, his shadow stretching toward me like it had a life of its own. He was closer than ever. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every flicker of shadow felt like him, every creak in the house a step closer. By morning, my fear had shifted into desperate resolve. I had to know what he wanted. Back at the library, I found more about Elias Greaves. The caretaker had vanished after rumors of him performing strange rituals in the cemetery. Some believed he was trying to bind spirits to the living, keeping them tethered to him even in death. The details were vague, but one thing was clear: his presence hadn't left the cemetery. The final piece was buried in an old journal from a local historian. It spoke of Greaves' connection to the cemetery's gates, how he used them as a portal between the living and the dead. "Those who cross his gaze are marked," the entry read. "He follows them until they answer his call." Marked. The word sent a chill through me. My reflection in the library window caught my attention. A faint, shadowy imprint lingered on my neck, a mark I hadn't noticed before. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. The air felt heavy, as if it were thickening around me. And then I heard it. A whisper. "Come back to the gates." My legs buckled as I bolted for the door, but deep down, I knew I couldn't run forever. The night was suffocatingly quiet as I approached the cemetery gates. The whisper had haunted me all day, repeating endlessly in my mind. Come back to the gates. I didn't want to be here. My hands trembled on the wheel as I pulled up to the same rusted iron fence that had become a part of my nightmares. He was waiting for me. This time, he stood just inside the gates, his pale face illuminated by the dim glow of the moon. The smirk was gone, replaced with a hollow, almost mournful expression. Slowly his hand rose, pointing toward the darkness beyond the graves. "No," I choked out, shaking my head. But my legs betrayed me. Before I realized what I was doing, I had stepped out of the car, the cold air biting against my skin. The closer I got, the more the shadows around him seemed to shift and writhe. His form flickered, as though he wasn't fully there. When I reached the gate, the air turned icy, and the world felt impossibly still. "I'm not going in," I whispered, but my voice cracked. His hollow eyes bore into mine, and then he moved closer, his steps eerily silent. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around. No one was there. But when I turned back, he was inches from me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his cold, lifeless smile. I woke up on the cold ground, the sharp sting of frost biting into my skin. The cemetery gates loomed before me, their iron bars slick with dew. My body felt heavy, like something was pressing me down. But when I looked, I was alone. Or so I thought. Shadows twisted unnaturally among the gravestones, moving even though the wind was still. The air was thick, suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to my feet, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move, And that's when I saw it, the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the gates. It was him, his pale face barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. His lips moved soundlessly, but I didn't need to hear the words to understand. I'd answered his call. The mark on my neck burned, and a low whisper filled the air, circling me, growing louder and louder. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt as the whispers turned into screams. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was home, safe in my bed. But on my window, smeared in dew, was the unmistakable imprint of a hand. And outside, under the flickering streetlight, he was still watching. If you ever pass by a cemetery and feel unseen eyes on you, don't slow down. Don't glance back. Just keep going. But tell me, will you check your rearview mirror tonight, or will you pretend not to see who's already there? When I first opened my eyes, all I could see was blackness. My body felt impossibly heavy, like the weight of the entire earth was pressing down on me. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry and the sound came out as a muffled gasp. That's when it hit me. I was buried alive. The air was stale, heavy, and thin. Breathing felt like trying to sip through a pinhole. My arms were pinned against my sides, and my legs were pressed together tightly. Dirt surrounded me, crumbling into my mouth whenever I tried to cry out. Panic surged through me as I thrashed against the unrelenting earth, only to find my movements met with resistance. My fists hit a hard surface above me, a wooden barrier, a coffin. My mind raced. How did I get here? The last thing I remembered was sitting at home nursing a headache. Had I passed out? Had someone thought I was dead? Or was I already dead? No, I whispered, my voice cracking. I was alive. I had to be. The coffin creaked slightly with my movements, and I froze. The sound was deafening in the silence. How much air did I have left? The thought of suffocating made my chest tighten even more, and I fought to steady my breath. In the oppressive darkness, time became meaningless. Seconds felt like hours, each heartbeat louder than the last. And then faintly I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to me. A whisper. The whisper wasn't clear, but it was there. A soft, almost rhythmic murmur. It sounded like words, though I couldn't make them out. My blood turned cold as I realized it was coming from above me. I pounded on the coffin lid, hoping someone had found me, but the whispering didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, more deliberate. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. My question was met with silence, the kind that presses against your ears like a weight. And then, something scratched against the lid of the coffin. Not like digging, a slow, deliberate scrape, as though nails were raking against the wood. My body froze. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my limbs were paralyzed. I bit my lip to keep from crying out, terrified of what might answer. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving me in an even deeper silence. Then, I felt it. A vibration. The faintest tremor, as though someone, or something, was shifting the earth above me. A low, guttural voice broke through the silence, too distorted to understand, but unmistakably inhuman. The sound reverberated through the coffin, chilling me to my core. I pressed myself against the sides of the coffin, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was out there. But there was nowhere to go. The coffin jolted, and I screamed, choking on the dirt that fell into my mouth. Something was pulling at it, shaking the wood like it was trying to pry it open. I didn't know if I should feel relief or terror. Was it help? Or was it something worse? The lid splintered slightly, and cold air rushed in. For a moment, I was too shocked to move. My lungs filled with the damp, earthy scent, and I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "Help me!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and raw. But as the lid cracked further, I saw something that froze me in place. Pale, slender hands, too long, too thin, were pulling at the wood. The nails were blackened, the skin gray and stretched tight over bony fingers. This wasn't human. I recoiled, pressing myself against the bottom of the coffin as the lid was wrenched open. The hands retreated momentarily, and then the whispering began again, louder this time. It sounded like chanting, the words guttural and sharp. A face appeared, if you could call it that. Hollow eyes stared down at me, their depths swirling with darkness. Its mouth opened, but the whispering didn't come from it. It was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing in my head. I was pulled upward, the bony hands gripping my arms with an unnatural strength. My body was limp, too weak to resist, too terrified to fight. The cold earth gave way as I was dragged through it. My skin scraped against roots and rocks, but the pain barely registered. All I could focus on was the creature's hollow gaze, locked onto me as it pulled me closer to the surface. Finally, I broke through. The night air hit me like a wave, sharp and freezing. Stars glittered above me, but their beauty was lost in the chaos of my mind. I was free, but I wasn't safe. The creature stood over me, its elongated form towering against the pale moonlight. It didn't move, but its whispering grew louder, reverberating in my chest like a heartbeat. I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the ground. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice raw. The creature tilted its head, as if considering my question. Its hand reached out, pointing toward the dark woods that bordered the cemetery. I didn't understand, but something deep inside me told me to run. The moment I turned, the whispering stopped. A silence so profound it was deafening. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me toward the woods. The cemetery blurred behind me, replaced by towering trees and shadows that seemed to reach for me. Every step felt like an eternity, my breath ragged, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it following. The air grew colder, the ground beneath me soft and unsteady, like it was trying to swallow me whole. Branches tore at my skin as I pushed deeper into the forest. The whispering returned, louder now, coming from all directions. The words were clearer, though I still couldn't understand them. They sounded ancient, like something primal and forgotten. A root caught my foot and I fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I struggled to get up, a shadow loomed over me, darker than the night itself. It crouched low, its hollow eyes staring into mine. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then it leaned closer, its mouth opening impossibly wide. Section 6. Just as I thought it was over, a light pierced through the darkness. It wasn't blinding, but it was warm and golden, cutting through the cold like a flame in the void. The creature recoiled, its form writhing and distorting as the light grew brighter. I turned toward the source, shielding my eyes, and saw something. It wasn't human, but it wasn't monstrous either. A figure of light, faceless yet comforting, stood between me and the creature. The whispering stopped, replaced by a sound like rushing wind, carrying a strange melodic hum. The creature let out a screech that echoed through the forest, and then it was gone, dissipating into the shadows like smoke. The light turned to me, enveloping me in warmth. For the first time since waking up in that coffin, I felt safe. The figure didn't speak, but I felt its presence as if it was telling me I was free. And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the forest. Section 7. I stumbled out of the woods, gasping for air, my body bruised and trembling. Every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let me go. When I finally broke free from the tangled trees, the cemetery stretched before me, eerily silent and untouched. The graves stood undisturbed, the headstones bathed in pale moonlight, as though the earth had never been disturbed by my presence, or my nightmare. I paused, my chest heaving, and looked back toward the woods. Shadows moved unnaturally, swirling as though the darkness itself was alive. I didn't wait to see if the creature would return. The walk home was a blur, my mind spinning with unanswered questions. Why had I been buried? Why had that thing followed me? And what was the light that saved me? None of it made sense, and the growing fear in my chest told me I might never find the answers. When I got home, I locked every door and window, pulling the curtains tight against the night. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging me into uneasy dreams. In them, I saw the creature and the light, not fighting, but circling one another. They weren't enemies. They were connected. And somehow, so was I. If you ever feel like you're being watched in the dark, trust your instincts. Not everything out there wants to hurt you, but not everything is here to save you either. But tell me, if you were buried alive, would you trust what saved you? Or would you wonder what it truly wanted?